Good evening, my little flockers. Welcome to Evelyn's Dark Web of Horror. I am Evelyn Ravencroft, and this is Azrael, my little sidekick. In tonight's episode, I'm excited to introduce one of the area's most prolific horror artists and storytellers, Scott Woodard. Scott is an accomplished author and playwright, but he also has gained a certain notoriety for his annual October Horror Drawing Challenge, where he challenges himself to create a new drawing each day of October, pulling inspiration from a variety of sources. I've followed him the last 2 years, and I've seen things I can't unsee, which is really saying something. Please welcome the multi-talented Scott Woodard.
Salutations. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining me, my dear. It's always a pleasure to see you, Scott.
Thank you. It's a lovely, scary place that you have here.
Oh, yes, it's frightening. I do declare. Well, I follow much of your work on social media. I know you're a big fan of horror. What is it about horror that you are attracted to?
I think for me, the things that attract me to horror are the same things that repel me from horror.
Ooh, do tell.
It's that Eros Thanatos relationship of love and death and the mixture of both, and the macabre associations with the imagery and with the psychological associations and that sort of thing. They scare me, they frighten me, they make me feel things. They make me feel passionate about being alive, and those are the things that attract me to them. I like being scared.
Yes, you like to be frightened. Get the shoes.
Yes, that's the abbreviated version.
Yes, nice. Well, don't feel like you have to abbreviate with me. You can tell me, my dear. Don't be frightened.
Alrighty.
Azrael wants to know if you've seen The Raven. He's a raven himself.
Yes, I'm quite a fan and of all of Poe's works. So yeah, I'm a big fan of all of the Corvus family: crows, ravens, magpies.
He says he's very happy that you've seen it.
Delighted.
Yes. So we're going to talk about your art in a few minutes, but you're a writer too. Tell me about some of the things that you've written.
A number of things. I'm an amateur of everything, a jack of all trades, master of none, as they say.
Or master of all.
Well, you're very kind to say so. But I've started off since I was very, very young. One of the very first things I remember writing in grade school was a story about a demonically possessed scarecrow and a witch and a jack-o'-lantern that had a big fight out in the middle of the field that was observed by children.
Ooh.
That was the first real...
In grade school?
Yes, that was about...
Goodness,
I had a lot of response from that sort of thing when I was a kid. And now, of course, I was just, aping the things that I'd see on television movies and that sort of thing. And then from there, I sort of accidentally fell into more and more writing, first through theater, which I started pretty late for a lot of people in college, actually. And then through there, started writing some of the things. The very first thing that I wrote for the stage was an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's work.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was an anthology play called Dream Within a Dream, which is one of Edgar Allan Poe's more famous poems. And in that, we did The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and The Raven, a few other little things like that.
Nice.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So I am familiar.
So you've written plays for the stage?
Yes, and through that I got more and more into writing, and as I've gotten older I spend more time thinking about things, and as I think about things I often translate that to the page or to the virtual page now these days, and to the computer screen. And so I've written a number of things at this point. My latest endeavor is an anthology of short stories that I've written, in the horror vein, titled Morbid Curiosities.
Ooh.
And we've been working on preparing that for self-publishing. And
nice.
I'm working currently on my first novel, which will be a classical ghost story, except this one is set in a theater, which I've had lots of experience in.
That's awesome. That sounds terrifying. When will that be released, and what is it called?
Well, it's called Ghost Light, and that's based on, I really like classic haunted stories, haunted house stories, and haunted house stories are fairly ubiquitous in the genre, going way back to the Turn of the Screw and Henry James and what have you, Poe. But despite the fact that auditoriums and theaters are all supposed to be haunted, there aren't a lot of books or short stories written about that. And so I've worked in the theater for about 30 years. Wow. And I felt that I have had the background in both horror and in theater to sort of write that story. And a ghost light is actually a reference to a tradition in theater where you leave, in a theater, you leave a single light, usually a naked bulb on a stand on the stage, partially in the traditional superstition to allow the ghosts that inhabit all auditoriums to perform their own little productions and plays.
Oh, how cool.
But it's also in a more mundane way, just a safety measure so that people don't walk off the end of the stage and break their neck.
Oh, well, that's very important too. Safety first,
I suppose
correct?
So, yes.
Well, much like myself, October is a very busy month for you. For the past 2 years, you've done the October Horror Drawing Challenge. Tell me about that.
Well, I was asked by a coworker several years ago, I guess it was about 8 or 9 years ago, around the time that I met my wife, Rachel, to do a drawing challenge. And these were becoming more popular on the internet. There would be a list of things, usually for a month, and they would have some random prompts, and I remember the prompt list that I was given at the time had things on it like favorite plant.
So you'd have to make a horror drawing with the favorite plant?
Well, not necessarily horror drawing. This one was just a generic one, but I couldn't think of a favorite plant. I couldn't even think of, in the context of when I thought about plants in,
like
in more of a casual way. Yes, right. Exactly. So I was like, I don't like this one. I don't like this prompt list. If you could come up with something more interesting,
right,
I will consider it. And so they did. And that's actually how I met my wife, because she was one of the contributors to that original list. And since I did that first one, which had some horror drawings in them, because I tend to gravitate towards that, I've had more requests to do sort of those drawing challenges. And they're called drawing challenges for a reason, because it is challenging to do a drawing every day for 30 or 31 days, which is what I've done for the last 2 years, to do 31 drawings. And so in the Inktober, this is what it's usually called, challenge is usually a pen and ink themed drawing challenge, and that appeals to me, so it's one of my favorite mediums to use, media. And so the last couple of years I've done stuff. This year, again, I couldn't find a prompt list that I liked, and so I found my own. There's a film that I'm very fond of called Cabin in the Woods, sort of a postmodern dissection of the genre, which I like. And in that film is a list of potential monsters that may appear in the film. No spoilers.
Ooh, don't spoil us.
No spoilers. But it's just a list of different kinds of creatures that could potentially be in the story. Ooh. And I thought, and it was just about the right number. I could combine a few and leave out maybe one or two, but I used that as my prompt list this year, and it was very successful. I enjoyed doing it.
That sounds a little more challenging than a plant.
Just a little, and that's the kind of that's the thing, is that in order to do something, a challenge like that, where you really spend a good amount every day drawing something out, and the way I normally work is I pencil the drawing first, and then I go over that in pen and ink. So I'm doing the same drawing twice, essentially, to give it that much attention for a full month. And I'm a very busy guy, usually in October too.
Yes.
I want something to drive me and something to really encourage me, and
How
that's
long
what
does
I
that
did.
take?
It depends. It really depends, and it really depends on how much available free time that I've got during the day. Some days I've only got, maybe 10, 15 minutes to put together some kind of real quick cartoon-like drawing. Some days I've got a lot more time. And I'm actually very strict with myself when I do these challenges. I do the drawings on the days that I'm supposed to do them. And there was only one situation that I allowed myself to get around that, where I was presiding over a wedding in Minnesota.
Goodness, so you can't really draw there.
So I was going to be a little busy. So
Right.
I actually, like a few days before, I did 3 or 4 drawings.
So can you share a few of those with us?
Yes, of this particular year, I think some of my favorites were, and again, these were all potential creatures from Cabin in the Woods, and if you watch real carefully, you can see some of these creatures pop up, but I use this as inspiration only. Very few of my drawings were literal interpretations of any of the creatures from the film. But the reanimated, I remember very well. I like that drawing very much. I actually took inspiration from the short story Herbert West Reanimator, which was turned into a series of films. The original story was written by weird fiction author H.P. Lovecraft. And it's sort of a pastiche of the Frankenstein model. It's a mad scientist creating creatures from the undead, and it's this spooky drawing of a sort of a decapitated head with grafted on hands and armpit pieces crawling. And I think the drawings that I particularly like are the ones I usually had a little bit more time to deal with, and I had a little bit more time with that. So.
Kind of flesh out your creativity.
Yes, flesh out. I like that. Yes, fleshed out. So I did like that one. The black unicorn drawing that I did was good. It was just supposed to be a unicorn, but I did a black unicorn, which was again a takeoff of actually one of my short stories that I wrote. Some years ago.
Oh, wow.
And I did a lot of my artwork tends to be illustrative in the fact that it tends to be inspired by literary works that I've read, and so like one of the prompts was The Bride, which was almost certainly a reference to The Bride of Frankenstein, which was the famous Universal film.
She had some awesome hair.
Yeah, exactly. You have awesome hair too.
Well, thank you.
Yes, you had a great
volume.
lightning ball.
Volume,
yes, volume, plenty of volume. Lots of undead moose up there.
Yes.
And but I decided to go into a different direction because I always try to do something a little unpredictable. So I thought of Bride, Miss Havisham from Great Expectations, because I think that's a bit of a horror story. And
nice
Dickens
twist.
is sort of, yes, I mean, Dickens isn't a stranger from horror stories. He wrote Christmas Carol and those sorts of things. Miss Havisham, for those of you who didn't read Great Expectations in middle school,
naughty.
yes, was a woman who was on her wedding day left by her groom. And
that's sadness.
Yes, and so she was in such shock. She literally never took off her wedding dress for 30 years and didn't keep up her house, and only had one shoe and one shoe off, and she had such a broken heart. She decided she was going to raise her young niece to break the hearts of every young man she ever met, including the hero of the story, Pip. And then she realizes in horror that she did the same thing that her groom did to her. And so this image of this frail, old, spiteful woman still in her wedding dress, I did a drawing inspired by that. And that's the thing, is that I think that we tend to think of horror as something that is outside the normal literary world, but really it's an all-inclusive genre, and we can find fragments of it in virtually every great story that exists,
Yes.
including Dickens.
It makes it more terrifying when it's more real.
Yes, exactly. So those were some of my favorites. Those three.
Well, they're magnificent pieces of work. So tell me how we can get these.
Well, I have. If you look up StrangeView Studios anywhere, just Google StrangeView Studios, which is my the house art studio online, and you'll find us on Facebook. You'll find us on Instagram, and we have shops on Zazzle, on Cafe Press, and lots of other places online where you can get prints and you can get all sorts of strange things, mouse pads, undergarments, if that's your thing,
Hand-drawn undergarments.
Yes, indeed. So yeah, products are out there.
We will need to go check that out and grab your favorites right now. Go ahead and grab them right now. What? Azrael, he wants to know if you can draw him.
I think that would be an honor if I could depict Azrael.
He's so delighted. Yay. Okay, so you have a strong interest in folk horror. Tell me what that is for those of you that don't know.
Folk horror is as difficult as to define horror. And it's difficult to define horror. We all think we know what it is until we try to explain to somebody what it is. Folk horror is that much more difficult. I think the first person to actually coin the term was Mark Gatiss, who is a British actor and author and director, who created the Hyde television series. He's doing an update of Dracula that's coming out, and he's an expert on horror. He's this guy who studied it a lot, and he noticed that there is this subgenre which became really to the forefront in the 1970s with several films that came out at that time. The Wicker Man, Blood on Satan's Claw, which is one of my favorite titles of all time.
Blood on Satan's Claw?
Blood on Satan's Claw.
Well,
I highly
terrifying.
recommend all of these films.
Yes.
And The Witchfinder General, which is a classic Vincent Price film. And these three films all had a very strong core common element in that they were all British and they were all about cultural norms, the defiance of cultural norms of that time, usually about a group of people encountering some sort of alien spirituality, usually found in the countryside. And with folk horror, with this idea of folk horror, is that the horror isn't a monster, isn't the supernatural, because some of these films don't have anything supernatural in them whatsoever. The Wicker Man doesn't. In The Wicker Man, the horror is just a community of people on this small island off the British Isles where people happen to be pagan rather than Christian.
Tell me what pagan means.
Pagan,
for those that don't know.
pagan just means it's an old concept when Christianity and the Christian Europe decided that people who practiced other religions were pagan and not Christian. And so this particular island, a modern island, off of the British Isles called Summer Isle, they happen to be pagan, and because it worked for them, and they just decide that they're going to bring in this unwitting police officer from the coast, ostensibly to find this missing girl, which he believes has been sacrificed, and because one of the ancient Druid practices, apparently, according to some history books, was to build a giant wicker man, a man made out of wicker, and put things that you wanted to sacrifice and give to the gods, usually a god of the sun, and you'd set it on fire.
Ooh.
And with those animals, and sometimes, according to some of the history books, people, and that may or may not happen in that movie. I highly recommend. And of course, I'm speaking of the original here, not the remake. We shall not speak of that.
Oh, okay.
But the original 1970s film with Christopher Lee.
1970s.
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, so Fall Car is about that sort of thing. It's, as you can see, the film doesn't have any dark castles in it, no storms, no monsters, nothing supernatural in it. But there's definitely a strong sense of horror. But the horror is cultural. It's
because
about,
it could really happen.
Yeah,
kind of.
and the idea that something like that could happen, the idea that there's something out there that's different from you, that perhaps is a bit more connected to the world, to the earth than you are. And that might be supernatural, it might be spiritual, it might be religious, it might just be just a simple cultural difference, it might just be an artistic aesthetic. But that idea of otherness is scary, and that's essentially the best way that you could explain Folk Car, is that Folk Car is about cultural differences and more of a sociological idea of horror, sociological and psychological.
And that's the worst kind of horror, in my opinion.
I think so
very
too.
Terrifying.
I
to
think
me.
so too, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's really interesting that right now we're seeing a sort of a revival of folk horror. And even though it had its British origins, we're seeing more American films explore that. Films that have come out recently, like The Witch and
Ooh, I'm a witch myself.
exactly, and some of these other Kill List and the recent film The Lighthouse, which came out, all have those aspects of horror, and they're a bit more intellectual. They take a little bit more. You have to watch them several times in order to really get why they're scary and why they're horrible. And if you're waiting for the next jump scare, the cat to leap out at you, or the monster to reveal itself, you'll be a little disappointed. But I tend to favor those sorts of stories.
I do as well, those that make you think and really dig deeper and, like we said, flesh them out.
That's right.
And see what that's about. So what is your favorite movie?
That's a big question. If you ask me on a different day, I'm going to give you a different answer depending on when you ask me. But some of my top favorite films tend to be horror, and they tend to be things that I saw when I was young that really scared me.
Because you were so young and impactful.
Yes. The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Stephen King's novel, is still, I think, one of the best films ever made, let alone horror films. And The Exorcist, both which came out in the 70s when I was a kid, and
Yes.
Scared the tar out of me,
Yes.
and they still scare me. And I find, and when I revisit them, I find new things to be scared of.
Right.
That's the thing that I find really interesting. When I was younger, I was scared to death of the devil and ghosts, and I might be possessed. When I watch The Exorcist now, I'm horrified by the idea of having a loved one with a mysterious illness that you can't find a cure for, you can't help. And then all those scenes where Reagan, the young daughter, is in the hospital and she's being examined and all the doctors shrug and throw up their hands. That now is the most frightening thing for me. So the idea, and The Shining's the same way, is that watching it as a child, when I was about Danny Torrance's age, I had certain fears, of that what would happen if my parents suddenly went crazy and tried to kill me. And now as an adult, and I'm the age of Jack Nicholson, and maybe a little older than him in that film, I have fears of turning into that person, the monster. And so I think that's what any good literature does, whether that's on film or in a book, is that it grows with you and it evolves with you, and I think those are two examples of some of the best. They're not really original, as far as a lot of people give those as some of their favorite horror movies. But I'd say that if I had to pick a third one, it would be Dario Argento's Suspiria. I saw that as an adult. I didn't see it as a kid. That is a giallo film with witches, and it's an Italian film, and we probably don't have enough time for me to explain what a giallo film is. But it's very visceral, it's over the top, it's operatic, there's lots of red, bright crimson red blood, and scary witches, and it's brutal and it's terrifying. And any film that can scare me as an adult is definitely on
Sounds
my
delightful.
list.
We'll have to check that out.
Yes, put that on your list too.
Well, you are definitely a jack of all trades. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time. And we have had a delightful evening here with you, talking about some things that you enjoy. Thank you, ladies and gents. Until next time.